Every physician at Vanderbilt had already walked away. 31 days after something inside him simply stopped fighting, the most ancient immortal in the American South was lying in room 2209, connected to machines that had no language for what he was. His own court had already begun succession proceedings. His enemies were moving through Nashville's oldest corridors like water finding cracks. And not one person who entered that room came out of love. Only calculation. Only hunger for whatever he left behind. But every night, I would push my cart down that hall and do the one thing no one else did. I would pull a chair close and talk to him, not because I knew what he was, not because I wanted anything from him, but because my Oma, my grandmother, had pressed both hands against my face when I was 7 years old and told me something I have never been able to unbelieve. The soul can hear what the body cannot. I was nobody, a 29-year-old janitor who cleaned floors for $12 an hour and counted quarters before buying milk. I had $11 in my account, a court threat sitting in my phone like a bruise I couldn't stop pressing, and a little girl at home who deserved a mother who wasn't this tired. And still, every night, I pulled that chair close. Nashville has always known how to keep its oldest secrets. I understood that before I understood anything else about this city. The honky-donks and the neon and the country songs about heartbreak, they're real. But beneath them, older agreements hold. Older debts. Older powers that the daylight world walks over without knowing, without ever feeling the ground shift beneath its feet. I know that now in ways I didn't then. But even on that first night, pushing my cart down the private ward corridor, I felt something in that hallway that I didn't have language for. A weight in the air. The particular stillness of a place holding something it wasn't supposed to be holding. Room 2209 was separated from the rest of the floor by a corridor that required a key card and, that night, by two men in dark suits who stood outside the door with the stillness of people who are paid not to have expressions. They had been there for 31 days. I knew because I had been there for 31 days too, just on the other side of the equation. They had not been paid to grieve. They had been paid to guard. There is a difference, though most people never have to learn it up close. Inside, the machines breathed for him. I learned his name in the second week, reading it off the chart at the foot of the bed, when I thought no one was watching. Gerald Arwell. That was the name the paperwork used. The name the living world was permitted to know. He lay against the white hospital sheets in a black silk robe that someone had brought, because even unconscious, apparently, certain dignities had to be maintained, and he was pale the way marble is pale. Not colorless, but cold. Carrying the memory of warmth without the warmth itself. His face was angular and still, and if you looked at it long enough, and I had looked at it long enough, 31 nights of looking, you began to understand that the stillness was not peaceful. It was the stillness of something that had been carrying enormous weight for an enormous amount of time and had, finally, simply stopped. 31 days. I didn't know then what his physicians were. I only knew they came and went quickly, in expensive clothes, with the tightly controlled faces of people managing information they weren't sharing with the floor staff. By the time I started my shifts, 2 of them had already stopped coming. I noticed that. I noticed most things on that ward, the way you notice everything when you are invisible, because invisibility, whatever else it costs, gives you an unobstructed view. There was a man named Aldrich who stood in the corridor beyond the keycard door on certain nights. I didn't know his name then either. I learned it later, the way I learned most things about that world in pieces after the fact, reconstructing the picture from fragments I hadn't known I was collecting. What I knew at the time was the quality of his waiting. I have been around enough dangerous stillness in my life to recognize it. He stood with his hands clasped and his expression arranged into concern, and every line of him said he was not concerned at all. He was calculating. And the calculation, whatever it was, appeared to be going well. Then there was the other one. The one who never left. He stood directly outside room 2209, not in the corridor, not at a comfortable professional distance, but right there, 6 feet from the threshold, every single night I arrived for my shift. Broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with eyes that had gone red at the edges from what I recognized as the specific exhaustion of someone who has refused to sleep because sleeping feels like abandonment. His jaw was set so permanently tight it had stopped looking like tension. It simply looked like his face now. I didn't know his name was Fergus then. I didn't know he had been standing beside the man in that room since 1741, through every form of loss that centuries can contain. I only knew that he was the one person in that entire ward who was still there because he couldn't make himself leave. And I understood that. In the marrow of my bones, I understood that. The court, whatever the court was, whatever that word meant in the context of the world I had unknowingly walked into, sent no flowers. It sent a legal representative on day 19 with documents I glimpsed briefly when Fergus took them at the door with both hands and a face that didn't move. Later, passing the end of the corridor, I saw him standing over the trash bin holding those papers for a long time. He didn't drop them. He folded them and put them in his inside pocket and stood there for another moment with his hand pressed flat against his chest, over the place where he'd put them. I looked away. Some grief is not meant to be witnessed. But I carried it with me into room 2209 that night, the image of it, the way I carried most of what I saw on that ward, quietly, without examining it too closely, letting it settle into the place where I kept the things that mattered without knowing yet exactly why. The machines breathed. The monitors measured what they could measure. I set my cart against the wall and did not reach for a single cleaning tool. I pulled the white plastic chair to its position, the same position, 31 nights of the same motion, and I sat down. I looked at his face, at the lines around his eyes that didn't belong on someone who appeared no older than 35, at the shadows beneath them that spoke of something that had been running for a very long time before it finally stopped. I had noticed, in the second week, that he looked the way I looked at 4 in the morning in my bathroom mirror, not broken, not defeated, but emptied. Hollowed by carrying too much for too long without ever being permitted to set any of it down. I didn't know what to do with that recognition. I only knew it was real. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and I began to speak. Quietly, the way I always did. The way a woman speaks when she has learned to take up very little space but has decided that this specific act, in this specific room, in this specific chair belongs to her. Siri learned a new word today, I said. In German first, then English. Mond. Moon. She pointed at the window and said both of them, one right after the other, like she wanted to make absolutely sure I understood. The machines breathed. The monitors held their flat, mechanical rhythm. And somewhere beneath all that stillness, beneath the silence that the living world had already decided was permanent, something that had been drifting in gray, endless suspension, felt the sound of my voice arrive like the only warm thing in a very cold and very vast dark. And it did not let go. I've thought about this a lot, in the months since. About what it means to talk to someone who can't answer. About whether it's an act of faith or an act of grief, or something that doesn't have a name yet because not enough people have been desperate enough to do it. I think it's all three. I think it's what you do when love has nowhere left to go. I didn't love him. I want to be clear about that because I know how this sounds, and I know what you're already thinking. I was a 29-year-old woman who cleaned floors for $12 an hour, and he was a stranger in a hospital bed, and what I felt when I sat beside him was not love. It was something quieter and older than that. It was recognition. The particular ache of seeing your own exhaustion reflected in another face and understanding, without words, that some weight doesn't care what life you're living when it decides to sit down on you. I talked to him the way I used to talk to my Oma on the phone when I was 17, and my mother had just been diagnosed, and I didn't know what to do with the fear except speak it into the air and hope that saying it out loud would make it smaller. It never made it smaller, but it made it bearable. There's a difference. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, sitting in that white plastic chair with my hands wrapped around nothing, was what my voice was doing on the other side of that silence. He told me later. Not easily. Not all at once. Gerald Arwell is not a man who gives you things easily, and he had 6 centuries of practice at keeping the most important truths close to the chest. But he told me eventually in pieces. The way you tell someone something that cost you, slowly, watching their face, making sure they understand the weight of what they're receiving before you hand it over. He said it was gray. Not dark. Not painful. Just gray. Endless and directionless and utterly without time. He said he didn't know how long he had been there. He said he stopped trying to count because counting required believing that the number would eventually matter, and somewhere in the gray, he had stopped believing that. He said voices came through sometimes. Cold ones, mostly. Professional ones, carrying words like brain activity and organ function and prognosis, words that landed in the gray like stones dropped into still water, creating a brief disturbance and then nothing, the surface closing over like they'd never come at all. He heard Fergus once, telling him he wasn't allowed to die, that Fergus refused to allow it, his voice cracking at the edges in a way that had made the gray press in heavier rather than lifting, because guilt, even across the boundary between living and whatever he was, still lands like guilt. He heard Aldrich once. A smooth, practiced sentence about the arrangements being in order. He said that voice had made him want to sink deeper just to deny him the satisfaction of being right. And then, on the third night, he wasn't sure it was the third, time had stopped meaning what it used to, something different arrived. A woman's voice. Low. A little frayed at the edges, the way voices get when the person using them hasn't had a full night of sleep in longer than they can remember. Not performing. Not trying to reach him, exactly. Just talking. The way you talk when you're not sure anyone is listening but you need to say the words anyway because keeping them in costs more than you have left to spend. She was talking about a little girl. About a word the child had learned. Mond. Then moon. Said twice in a row, she told him. Like the child wanted to make absolutely sure she'd covered all her bases. And something in the gray, some part of him that had been going still for 31 days, moved. Just slightly. The way a compass needle moves when it gets close to something it was always meant to point toward. He said he didn't understand why. He had heard beautiful things before. He had heard music that made cathedrals feel small, and declarations that had toppled kingdoms, and the particular silence after a thunderstorm that sounds like the earth exhaling. He had heard 600 years of human sound, and learned to let most of it move through him the way wind moves through a space that no longer has walls. But this voice talked about a stuffed bear with one eye. About the way a small hand tightened around her finger on the 6:04 bus when the February cold pushed through the doors. About a refrigerator with eggs and milk that was 3 days from turning, and how she'd stood in front of it that morning doing the arithmetic that poor people do, the kind where every answer is wrong, and you're only choosing the least wrong one. She wasn't performing sorrow. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just telling it, the way you tell the truth when you're too tired to construct anything more elaborate. And that precise quality, the absence of agenda in every syllable, was what moved through 31 days of gray and found something in him that had not been findable for a very long time. He said when her voice faded each night, the gray came back faster, heavier, like a door closing on the only light in a room. He said he started to wait for it. I didn't know any of that then. I only knew that every night I sat in that chair, something in me that had been clenched for years, since Derek, since the stairs, since the hospital bill, since the specific loneliness of raising a child alone in a city that doesn't slow down for you, loosened. Just slightly. Just enough to breathe. I talked to him because my Oma said the soul can hear what the body cannot. What I didn't understand yet was that I was also listening. That somewhere in the act of speaking into that silence, night after night, I was beginning to hear something I had forgotten the sound of. My own voice. Saying things that mattered. Being received. I didn't have a name for it yet. I was too tired and too broke and too deep inside the arithmetic of survival to stop and name it. But I felt it. The way you feel something before you understand it, in the chest, below the ribs, in the place where the things that are about to change you always arrive first. People always want to know where kindness comes from in a person. They want it to have a clean origin. A moment. A lesson learned in the right light with the right music underneath it. They want it to be the product of goodness, of ease, of a life that left enough room for softness to grow. Mine didn't come from any of that. Mine came from a woman who crossed an ocean with $30 and a prayer and raised me in a city that didn't speak her language, and who never, not once, not even at the end when she had every reason to turn bitter, stopped treating strangers like they were worth her full attention. Mine came from exhaustion and loss and the specific education of having things taken from you until you understand, bone deep, which things cannot be taken unless you hand them over yourself. I am not kind because my life was gentle. I am kind because I decided a long time ago that my life being hard was not a good enough reason to make someone else's harder. That's not virtue. That's just arithmetic. My mother came to Nashville from Frankfurt in 1993 with my grandmother's blessing stitched into the lining of her coat. Literally stitched, a small square of paper with the old words written in my Oma's handwriting, half Gaelic and half German, because that was how my grandmother prayed, in two languages at once, as if God might understand one better than the other, and she didn't want to risk it. My mother found work cleaning houses in Belmead, the kind of houses that had more bathrooms than people, and she cleaned them without complaint for 11 years and sent money home and learned English from the television and raised me in a one-bedroom apartment on Buchanan Street where the radiator knocked all winter and the neighbors played music on Friday nights that came through the walls like a heartbeat. She died when I was 22. Quickly, which is the word people use when they mean before anyone could stop it. A stroke in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning in November. I had spoken to her the Sunday before. I had not said anything important. I have not entirely forgiven myself for that, and I don't think I'm supposed to. My Oma died 6 months later. I think she simply decided there was nothing left on this side worth staying for, and I can't blame her. I understood the math. And then I was alone. In the way that has no dramatic music underneath it, just the ordinary, relentless silence of a life that used to have people in it, and now doesn't. Derek came 18 months after that. I want to be careful here, because I'm old enough now to know that I walked toward him with my eyes open. I am not going to tell you I didn't see the signs, because I did. I am going to tell you that when you are 24 and alone in a city and you have been carrying grief so long that it has started to feel like your actual skeleton, when someone looks at you like you are the answer to a question they've been asking for years, you make choices. Choices that the version of you who comes later, the one who has paid for them, will understand even while she grieves them. He was from Hendersonville. He had a truck and a construction business and a way of talking that made you feel chosen. It lasted 8 months before I understood what I had walked into. It didn't end dramatically. It ended with a phone call I made from a gas station on Dickerson Pike at 6 in the morning with a split lip and nowhere to go, and a women's shelter coordinator named Bertie who answered on the second ring and said, "Honey, just tell me where you are," in a voice so matter-of-fact and so kind that I cried for 10 minutes before I could answer her. I was 4 months pregnant. I didn't know yet. Siri was born 7 weeks early at Vanderbilt, the same hospital where, 5 years later, I would push a cleaning cart down a hallway and pull a chair close to a dying man's bed and speak into his silence every night. I have thought about that, about how the same building held both the worst night of my life and the one that changed it. I don't know what to make of it except that places, like people, contain more than one truth at the same time. She weighed 4 pounds and 11 ounces. She fit inside both of my hands with room left over. And I sat beside her incubator in the NICU, and I recited my Oma's blessing, half German, half Gaelic, the same words my grandmother pressed into the lining of my mother's coat, and I told her we were going to be all right. I didn't know how. I just knew that she needed me to believe it, so I did. That is the version of me that pushed a cart into room 2209 every night. Not naive. Not untouched. Not discovering that the world can be hard. Already knowing it, already fluent in it. Already carrying it. The $12,800 in debt from Siri's birth and her pneumonia hospitalization. I knew that number by heart the way you know a scar. Derek's custody threat sat in my phone like a stone. The second late notice from my landlord was folded in the front pocket of my uniform. My refrigerator had eggs and milk and not much else. I knew exactly what my life cost and exactly what it weighed. And still, every night, I pulled that chair close. Not because I had extra to give. I want you to understand this. There was no surplus. There was no leftover kindness sitting on a shelf waiting to be distributed. I gave it from the same place I gave everything else, from the bottom, from the place that was already scraped nearly bare, from the stubborn and perhaps irrational belief that the one thing I would not surrender was the ability to see another person and treat them like they were worth being seen. Derek took many things from me. Grief took others. Poverty takes in ways people who haven't lived it cannot count. But that The choice to speak to a silent stranger as if his soul was worth addressing, that was mine. That had always been mine. And I had decided, without ceremony, without anyone watching, that it would stay mine no matter what else was taken. Some nights that was the only thing I owned outright. Some nights it was enough. There is a specific kind of grief that nobody warns you about. Not the grief of losing someone you loved for years, someone whose absence reshapes the entire architecture of your daily life. I knew that grief. I had carried it since my mother's kitchen, since the Tuesday in November that split my life into before and after. This was something different. This was grieving someone you were never supposed to have. Someone who was never yours to lose. And yet the loss was real, arriving in my chest with the same dull, certain weight as every other loss I had known, because some connections don't ask permission before they form. Some of them just find the crack in the wall and grow through it quietly, and you don't notice until the day someone tells you the wall is coming down, and you realize how much of yourself had started leaning against it. Nurse Oda found me at the supply station before my shift. She was a small, precise woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair she kept pinned back, and the particular quality of stillness that comes from decades of delivering news that cannot be softened, only delivered more carefully. She had never said much to me beyond the necessities. But she had, on 7 separate occasions over the past month, left a thermos of hot coffee outside the service elevator on the private ward floor with no note, no explanation, no acknowledgement that she had done it. Just the thermos. Just the warmth. That kind of kindness, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself. I recognize it immediately. It's the same kind I try to practice. You learn to spot it in other people the way you learn to spot anything you've spent a long time doing in the dark, by the shape of it, by the absence of performance. She touched my arm, just briefly, and she told me, 72 hours. The representative had signed. The machine would be turned off. I don't remember exactly what I said. Something functional. Something that indicated I had heard and understood, and would behave accordingly. And then I stood there at the supply station for a moment after she walked away, my hands flat on the cart handle, breathing in a deliberate and effortful way that I had learned in Bertie's shelter. The breath that means you are not going to fall apart here, not in this hallway. I didn't fall apart. I never fall apart in hallways. I save it for later, for the places where no one has to witness it and decide what to do with what they've seen. I left the cart at the station. For the first time in 31 nights, I walked into room 2209 with empty hands. The room was the same. Of course it was. Rooms don't register the weight of what's about to happen to them. The monitors held their rhythm, indifferent and mechanical. The amber light from the wall fixture fell across the white sheets the way it always did, making everything look softer than it was. The window showed a piece of Nashville sky, February dark, a handful of stars visible between the clouds. I pulled the chair close. Same position. Same distance from the bed. My hands knew the motion without me directing them. I looked at his face for a long time. He was pale in the way that had stopped frightening me somewhere around day 10, that particular cool stillness that I had learned to see past, the way you learn to see past the surface of anything you sit with long enough. Beneath it, the same thing I had seen from the beginning, exhaustion that went deeper than the body. The exhaustion of something that had been required to be enormous for so long it had forgotten it was allowed to rest. I pressed my hand to his forehead, cold as marble, as it always was. I closed my eyes, and I said my Oma's blessing. All of it, the way she taught me, starting in German, the syllables she had learned from her own mother in a village outside Inverness that she carried to Frankfurt like a seed carried in a pocket, crossing weather and time and ocean and 2 generations to arrive, finally, in a hospital room in Nashville, in the mouth of a woman talking to a dying stranger. Half German, half Gaelic. Entirely mine now. The most valuable thing I have ever inherited. I said it slowly. I meant every word. Then I took his hand. His hand was larger than mine and still, completely, absolutely still. I wrapped both of mine around it, and I held it the way I hold Siri when she wakes from a nightmare. Not trying to fix anything. Just present. Just saying, with the pressure of my palms, you are not alone in this moment. Whatever this moment is, You are not alone in it. I told him I was sorry. Not for anything I had done. I was sorry the world had not taken better care of him. I was sorry that every person who had come into this room over 31 days had come for something other than him. I was sorry that whatever had brought him here, whatever betrayal, whatever accumulated weight, had been heavy enough to stop a creature that had survived 6 centuries of everything else. I told him I hoped wherever he was going was quieter than here. I meant it. If the gray he was drifting in was peace, even empty peace, even the absence of feeling rather than the presence of rest, then maybe it was better. Maybe some things that have carried enough weight for long enough deserve to finally put it down. I sat with him for a long time after that. Not talking. Just sitting. The way I used to sit with my mother in her last weeks, when words had stopped being the point and presence was the only thing left to offer. When I finally stood, I pushed the chair back to its place against the wall. I didn't look back. I knew myself well enough to know that if I looked back, at his face, at the hand I had just been holding, at the room that had been, for 31 nights, the one place in my entire life where I was allowed to say true things out loud without anyone asking me to be practical about them, I would not be able to walk out. And I had Siri to get back to. I had a bus to catch. I had eggs in a refrigerator and a debt on a piece of paper and a tomorrow that required me to still be functional inside it. So I didn't look back. I walked out, and I let the door close behind me, and I stood in the hallway for exactly 4 seconds, breathing, and then I collected my cart, and I finished my shift. That is what it looks like to grieve quietly. That is what it looks like to be a woman who has learned that the world does not pause for your sorrow, so you carry it alongside everything else, in the same hands, on the same body, without putting anything down, because you cannot afford to put anything down. I went home at 6 in the morning. I unlocked the apartment. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched Siri sleep for a long time, her small chest rising and falling, one hand curled around the ear of the one-eyed bear. And I let myself, very quietly, in the gray before sunrise, cry for a man I had never actually met. I have made a lot of hard choices in my life. I want you to understand that before I tell you about this one. I have made choices in gas station parking lots and shelter hallways and hospital waiting rooms and the dairy aisle of a grocery store where I stood for 4 minutes deciding between formula and bread because I could not afford both and Siri needed both. I have made the kind of choices that people who have never been poor look at and say, but couldn't you have just? And the answer is always no. There was no just. There was only the choice in front of me, and the consequences branching out from each option like roads I could see but not afford to travel all of them. This was the worst one. Not because of what I chose. Because of what it cost to choose it. Because of the face of my daughter, while I made it. Derek's message arrived at 2:14 in the morning. I was already awake. I am almost always already awake at 2:14 in the morning. That particular hour belonging to the category of time that exists outside of sleep for anyone carrying enough weight. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, doing the arithmetic. Rent was due in 9 days. The collections agency had called twice that week in its polite, robotic voice. My afternoon laundromat shift had been cut by an hour on Thursday, which meant the numbers I had been holding together with both hands had slipped again, slightly, in the way that small slippages do when there is no margin to absorb them. The message was short. Derek's messages were always short. He had a talent for compressing maximum damage into minimum words. I had learned that about him early when the words were sweet, and I was still learning the full range of what that talent could do. He said he'd spoken to a lawyer. He said he had documentation that Siri was being left alone at night. He said if I wanted to handle it quietly, I should call him back. I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone face down on the table and sat with my hands wrapped around the cold cup, and I breathed the way Bertie taught me, the slow, deliberate breath that means you are not going to let him see you fall, even through a phone screen, even at 2 in the morning, even now. He didn't want Siri. I knew that with a certainty that lived below thought, in the place where you keep the things you have paid too much to learn. He had never wanted Siri. What he wanted was the specific power of knowing that he could reach me. That no matter how far I had walked from that gas station on Dickerson Pike, he still had a hand on something I could not afford to lose. That is a particular kind of cruelty. The kind that doesn't require proximity. The kind that just sits in your phone and waits. I deleted the message. Then I retrieved it from the deleted folder and read it again. Then I deleted it a second time and turned the phone over and went to check on Siri. Her forehead, when I pressed my lips to it, was burning. Not the mild warmth of a child who has been sleeping hard. The unmistakable, frightening heat of a fever climbing while you weren't watching. I pulled her blanket back and felt her cheeks, her neck, the soft skin behind her ears. All of it hot. Her breathing was heavier than it should have been, and she had the particular limpness of a sick child, that boneless, worrying stillness that is the opposite of the restless, healthy sleep of a well one. I ran the cold cloth. I ran it again. I gave her the last of the children's fever medicine, tipping the bottle carefully to catch every drop. I sat on the floor beside her bed with my hand on her back, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing, doing what mothers do in the dark when medicine has been given and there is nothing left to do but wait and watch and refuse to look away. The free clinic on Jefferson Street opened at 9 on weekdays. It was Sunday. Mrs. Hannah, who lived 3 doors down and who had watched Siri through more desperate shifts than I could count, had gone to Chattanooga on Friday to visit her son and wasn't back until Monday evening. I had her number memorized, and I stared at it in my phone for a long time before I accepted that calling her at 3 in the morning to drive back from Chattanooga was not a thing I was willing to do to a 67-year-old woman who had already given me more grace than I had any right to ask for. The emergency room was open. The emergency room was always open. The emergency room had already given me $12,800 in debt for Siri's pneumonia, and the collections agency was still calling twice a week, and I did not have the ability, financially or emotionally, to walk through those doors again. I sat on the floor beside my daughter's bed, and I held both of those facts at the same time. She needs care, and I cannot afford the care, and I did what I always do when I reached that particular wall. I did not scream. I did not break anything. I simply sat with it, the way you sit with pain that has no immediate solution, breathing around it, waiting for the next option to appear. My phone rang at 4:15. The shift supervisor. Her voice was apologetic and tired, and underneath both of those things, quietly desperate in the way supervisors get when 3 people have called in sick and the building still requires cleaning regardless of what the individual lives of its cleaning staff look like at 4:15 on a Sunday morning. She offered double pay before I could say anything, which meant she already knew the answer was going to be no, and she was trying to make it yes before I had the chance to refuse. Double pay for a 12-hour shift. I did the arithmetic in the time it took to breathe in and breathe out. Rent. The collections agency. The medicine I needed to buy before Monday. The knot in my chest that had been tightening for 9 days loosening, just slightly, just enough. I looked at Siri. She was flushed and small against her pillow, her hand curled around the one-eyed bear's ear, her breathing still heavier than I wanted it to be, but steadier now that the medicine had started its work. She was not in danger. I had been a mother long enough to know the difference between sick and endangered. She was sick. She needed watching and warmth, and her mother close. And her mother needed to keep the roof above her head for 1 more month. I told the supervisor I would come in. I set the phone down, and I sat there for a while longer than I had time to sit. Then I got up. I warmed a cloth and wiped Siri's face and hands. I dressed her in the warmest pajamas she owned. I wrapped her in the thick blanket, the good one, the one I kept for exactly the kind of night where the cold outside was not optional. I pulled the knit hat down over her ears, the one with the small bear ears on top that she had chosen herself at a thrift store on Gallatin and refused to be parted from. I tucked the one-eyed stuffed bear into the crook of her arm. She barely stirred. She trusted me that completely. That absolutely. It is the most humbling thing I have ever been given, and some nights it is also the heaviest. I put on my coat. I put hers on over the blanket. I lifted her onto my shoulder, her head falling against my neck, her heat radiating through the layers between us, and I walked out of the apartment and down the 5 flights of stairs. The elevator had been broken for 2 weeks, and out into the February dark of Buchanan Street. The cold hit us immediately. Siri made a small sound and pressed her face harder into my neck. I held her tighter. I walked toward Gallatin Pike. The 6:04 bus came on time, which felt, in that moment, like the only mercy the morning was willing to offer. I got on with one hand holding my daughter and nothing else in my coat pocket but my employee badge and my apartment key. I found a seat near the back and I held Siri against my chest and I watched Nashville move past the window in the early dark. The gas stations and the shuttered storefronts and the streetlights still burning against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it was night or morning. I thought about the man in room 2209, about the goodbye I had said, about the 72 hours and what came after them. I thought, at least he is going somewhere quieter than this. And then I held my daughter tighter, and I rode toward the hospital, and I did not let myself think about how close to the edge we were. Because looking at the edge, when you are this close to it, serves no purpose. You simply keep moving. You keep your child warm. You breathe. You get to the next hour. That is the only arithmetic that matters at 6:04 in the morning in February, on a bus in Nashville, with everything you have in the world asleep on your shoulder. I need to tell you something before I tell you what happened. I need you to understand that I am not a woman who believes in magic. I was raised on prayers. Yes, my Oma's words, my mother's faith, the old blessing stitched into a coat lining crossing an ocean. But belief, for me, has always lived alongside the arithmetic. Alongside the cold facts of refrigerators and rent notices and medical debt. I have never had the luxury of letting faith replace the practical. I have only ever been able to carry both at the same time and hope they didn't pull me in directions I couldn't follow. So when I tell you what happened in room 2209 in the early hours of that Monday morning, I need you to know I am not embellishing. I am not reaching for meaning where there was none. I am telling you exactly what occurred, in the order it occurred, as plainly as I know how. And I still don't have words for all of it. I set Siri up in the basement break room just after 7. Spread her blanket across the vinyl bench against the wall, tucked the one-eyed bear into her arms, turned the overhead light to its lowest setting. She was exhausted enough from the fever and the bus ride that she fell asleep within minutes, and I stood watching her chest rise and fall until I was certain the rhythm was steady. Then I went upstairs and I worked. 40 minutes per floor. Then down to check on her. Then back up. 3 floors, then 4, then back down, my legs learning the stairwell by feel because I was too afraid of running into a supervisor in the elevator looking breathless and guilty. Every time I opened the break room door, I held my breath until I saw her still there, still sleeping, still small and flushed, and clutching the bear. And every time I had to leave again, I left a piece of something behind me that I had to go back for with my eyes. By 11, the fever had climbed again. I know because I pressed my lips to her forehead when I came down to check, and the heat was immediate and alarming, higher than it had been on the bus, higher than it had been at 3 in the morning in our apartment. She was awake and fussing, not crying yet, but building toward it, her eyes glassy and unfocused, her small body twisting against the blanket with the restless discomfort of a child whose body is fighting something and losing ground. I gave her water. I wiped her face. I held her for 20 minutes, rocking her the way she liked, humming the fragment of a German lullaby my mother used to hum to me that I only half remembered, but sang anyway because the half I remembered was the half she needed. She settled slightly. Not enough. When I tried to set her back down, she arched against me and cried, and the cry was the particular sound, thin, exhausted, genuine, that I have never been able to hear without it moving through me like current. I could not leave her in the break room again. Not like this. I knew it the way I know most true things. Not through reasoning but through the body, the same way I knew the night Derek stood at the top of the stairs that something irrevocable was about to happen. I made a decision. The kind with consequences I couldn't fully see. I lifted Siri onto my shoulder. I picked up the one-eyed bear from the bench and tucked it into her arms. And I carried my feverish daughter up 4 flights of stairs to the private ward. The guards outside room 2209 knew my face. 31 nights of the same woman, the same cart, the same quiet. It builds a kind of recognition that doesn't require explanation. The older one looked at Siri on my shoulder, at her flushed cheeks and the bear, and the knit hat still on her head from the bus, and he looked at me. And then he simply stepped aside. No words. Just space. The particular mercy of someone who understands what they're looking at and chooses not to make it harder. I went in. I meant to clean the room one-handed. I had done it before, managed mop handles and trash bags and surface wipes with one arm occupied, because motherhood is largely the practice of learning to do everything with whatever limbs remain available.
But Siri would not be set down.
Not in the chair. Not on the small sofa against the wall. I tried laying her on the folded blanket on the floor and she screamed. Immediately, piercingly. The sound filling the quiet room and sending panic through me in a wave, because if the guards heard it, if a supervisor heard it, if anyone came through that door and found me here with a sick child in a private patient's room. I stood in the middle of room 2209 with my daughter crying against my chest and my heart hammering, and every option I had closing one by one like doors at the end of a hallway. And then I looked at him. He lay there as he always had.
Still. Pale.
The black silk robe against white sheets, his face carrying its centuries of exhaustion, his chest rising and falling in the shallow, mechanical rhythm of a man kept breathing by a machine's insistence rather than his own will. 72 hours. The clock was already running. I don't know how to explain what I did next except to say that I was a mother who had run out of everything, options, energy, pride, alternatives, and there was a surface that was warm and broad and still, and my daughter was burning and crying, and I needed her to stop, needed her to sleep, needed one single thing to be manageable for 5 minutes so I could think. I whispered an apology to him. I meant it completely. And I placed Siri on his chest. She stopped crying before I had fully let go of her. Not gradually. Not the slow winding down of a child being soothed. An immediate, absolute silence. Like a switch thrown, like a circuit completed. She went still the moment she touched him. And then, in the space of 3 or 4 seconds, she did what she had been fighting all day. She curled. Her small body turned inward like something finding its shape, her fever-warm cheek pressing against his chest just above where his heart would be, her tiny hand reaching out and gripping the fabric of his black robe with the determined, reflexive grasp of a child who has found what she was looking for and has no intention of releasing it. She slept. Truly, deeply, peacefully slept. Her breathing evened out. The distress lines around her small mouth released. I stood frozen for so long, I lost count of the seconds. Then I reached for her, carefully, minimally, barely touching, and the moment my hand made contact she whimpered without waking and tightened her grip on his robe. I stopped. I tried once more. She cried out, immediate, even in sleep, as if her body was registering the loss before she was conscious enough to name it. I placed her back, and she stilled. A third time. The same. I did not try a fourth. I pulled the chair to its place. The same chair, the same position, 31 nights of the same motion, and I sat down. And I looked at my daughter sleeping on the chest of a man the world had declared already gone, and I did the only thing left to me. I started talking. About the moon and the bear, and the bus in the February dark. About Derek's message, and what it had felt like to read it at 2:14 in the morning at a kitchen table with cold tea. About $12,800 and rent, and the arithmetic that never adds up no matter how many times you run it. About the way Siri says Luna, not as a learned word but as a declaration, with the total confidence of a child who has never been given a reason to doubt that the moon will be there when she looks for it. That beautiful things exist. That the world contains reliable light. I talked because it was what I had always done in this room. I talked because silence felt like surrendering something I wasn't ready to give up. An hour passed. The monitors held their rhythm. Then 2 hours. Siri slept on, her breathing quiet, and even against his chest, the fever seeming impossibly, or perhaps not impossibly, to ease. As if whatever warmth he carried beneath that stillness was giving her body something to work with. I stopped questioning it. I stopped questioning most things around 1:30 in the morning. You reach a point in exhaustion where analysis requires more than you have left, and you simply let what is happening be what it is. At some point close to 2 a.m., I looked up at the monitor. I looked at it for a long time, not trusting what I was seeing. The line was different. Not dramatically, not the violent, cinematic surge of films about miraculous recoveries. Just a small, almost imperceptible change in rhythm. Like something that had been holding itself perfectly mechanically still had shifted slightly into something more organic. more deliberate, like a heart that had been following orders beginning, quietly, to have opinions of its own. I watched it for 20 minutes without speaking. Then I kept talking because stopping felt dangerous. Because I understood on some level I couldn't have articulated that the thread was fragile, and the thread was real, and I was the one holding it and I could not put it down. At 4:08 in the morning, I felt it. Pressure. Against my hand, which had been resting open on the edge of the bed beside his for the past hour, close but not touching, and then touching, because something was pressing against my fingers. A single finger. Moving. I stopped breathing. I waited. The finger moved again. Then his entire hand, slowly, with the deliberate effort of something that had forgotten the mechanics of motion and was relearning them from the beginning, closed around mine. I did not scream. I did not move. I sat absolutely still, my hand inside his, and I felt tears running down my face before I registered that I was crying. Silent tears, the kind I had mastered, but coming fast, coming from somewhere very deep. Then, in the amber light of room 2209, after 31 days of nothing, Gerald Arwell opened his eyes. They were dark and unfocused at first, looking without seeing, taking in the ceiling and the light and the shapes of the room with the slow, searching quality of someone finding their way back from a very long distance. Then they cleared. And the first thing they found before me, before the monitors, before any of the room's hard white edges, was the small crown of blonde hair tucked beneath his jaw. Siri's hand, still gripping his robe. He looked at her for a long time, and something in his face, that carved, exhausted, centuries-worn face, moved in a way I had no word for. Not shock. Not confusion. Something quieter and more fundamental than either. Something that looked, from where I sat, like recognition. Like arriving somewhere you did not know you had been traveling toward.
He did not speak.
He did not reach for anything, not the call button, not the tubes, not his own face. He raised one hand, slow, trembling, weak with an unfamiliarity that must have been strange for a body that had not known weakness in 600 years, and placed it on Siri's back. Not moving her, not disturbing her, just covering her, shielding her.
As if it were the most natural thing.
As if his body knew, before his mind had fully returned to it, that this was what the moment required. I pressed the call button. I pressed it again. My free hand was shaking. My other hand was still inside his, and I did not let go. In the parking garage 4 floors below, a man named Fergus, who had not slept in 31 days, received a call. He answered immediately. He heard 3 words. He dropped the phone. His hands, steady through 1741 and every year that followed, through battles and betrayals, and every form of loss that centuries can contain, shook for the first time since 1918. And somewhere in the story of how the world works, something ancient and broken had just decided, quietly and without fanfare, to stay. If this story found something in you, if you felt the weight of it, the realness of it, the way it lives in the same place as your own quietly carried things, then please don't let it disappear. Stay close. There are other women in these stories. Other moments where something lost finds its way back. They're here, and they were always meant for you.